You can get your Bible out and begin to open up to the book of Matthew. We are just beginning a study of the book of Matthew. It's always an exciting thing to begin a brand new study. And we are doing that this evening. Glad that you're here. And we will try to get a foothold in this evening and see how far we can get in our study sheet handout. Sometimes, and it may even be this way when you open up your Bible to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You might see in your Bible the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke, and the Gospel of John. My Bible, particularly the New American Standard that I'm holding, says the Gospel according to Matthew. I like that better. That's a little more accurate. We are not looking at four Gospels. We are looking at, and gospel basically means good news. We are looking at the account of four different men of the life of Christ. And so you have a perspective from Matthew's viewpoint, Mark's, Luke's, and John's. And they all have a purpose in that. They all have an audience that they're writing to. And so they will include or exclude certain things to meet the need of their audience. So if you're talking to one audience, maybe certain aspects of the life of Christ are going to make more sense to them. Or you can tell about that in a certain way that will make more sense to them. You might even think, and we'll be getting into this when we get into about Matthew chapter 13 with the parables. You can watch Jesus tell His parables, and you can spot the geography that He's in by the parables that He tells in a place. If He's in a place where agriculture makes more sense, there is a pocket of geography in Canaan land that would have to do with that. And He'll talk about sowing seed, or He'll talk about farming in that area. Other places it might make more sense to talk about animals. And so He might talk about sheep or something like that in a parable in that particular geography. When we look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as they're speaking to their various audiences, they will include or exclude those things that make sense to their particular listeners. And when you take Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and you put them all together, you will get the fullest, richest picture of the life of Christ. I've mentioned a number of times there are books that you can get that will help you to do that in just a glance. I tend to favor McGarvey's Fourfold Gospel, where he will put together Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John on a page. And he will help you see the full picture of that as you read through that account, and you'll have all four of those sort of pushed together. Robertson has a book like that, and several others do. And you can find one that maybe is easier for you to read, where instead of flipping back and forth to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you can have them all there on one page for you to look at it once and get that full picture. So if you don't have a book like that, you might think about looking into it. And I think McGarvey's Fourfold Gospel is probably online in PDF version now for free. You can just look it up and find it there. And so you don't even have to spend money, just a little bit of time. We assume that Matthew is writing to what kind of audience? Jewish. And why do we say that? Why would we suppose that Matthew's writing to a Jewish audience? What are our clues? Okay, genealogy. Luke also has a genealogy. Is he writing to Jews because he has a genealogy? It's a good point. what is there about the genealogy in the book of Matthew that would cue you in that he's talking to a Jewish audience? Okay, we have a little bit of work to do with that. Any other clues? Genealogy is true, but there's something particular about it. Any other clues? All right, let's begin to look at that. There are a number of Old Testament quotes and references that would only be understood by a Jewish audience. Remember, the Jews were given the law of Moses. And so they had access to Old Testament, spent a lot of time in Old Testament. And one of the identifiers of Jesus as the Son of God and the coming Messiah is that He is fulfilling Old Testament prophecy. So as Matthew alludes to a whole bunch of Old Testament prophecies, and he does that, his audience would pick up on that. They would recognize those references, and they would go, yes, I see where what Isaiah talked about or what Jeremiah talked about, how that makes sense in the life of Christ. They'd be able to put those things together, and so it would make sense to a Jewish audience, but not to a Gentile audience. They didn't spend time in the Old Testament. That would be rare for them to be able to do that. One of the things that I did that I just kind of had fun with is I looked up the word prophet. And I made a printout, and it ended up being three sheets of paper. And I did a printout of all the places in the book of Matthew where you find the word prophet. And I began to look at some of those. And let me just read a little sample of these. Matthew 1:22. Now all this took place to fulfill what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Chapter 2, verse 5, they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. Chapter 2, verse 15, he remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Out of Egypt I've called my son. Chapter 2, verse 17, then what had been spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. And that just goes on and on and on and on down through the book of Matthew 40 times. I think like 37 verses. And then there are another, 20 or so references to Old Testament prophecies. That makes sense to the Jewish mind, not to the Gentile mind. That's one of the big clues that Matthew is writing to the Jews. And then Gwen brought up the idea of the genealogy. Thought it was interesting. John, visiting with us tonight, met him as we're coming in, and he said, what are you doing in here? I said, we're going through the book of Matthew, just starting the book of Matthew. He said, oh, we're going to be reading the genealogy. Exactly. That's how Matthew begins. First 17 verses, genealogy of Christ. But there's something about this. It would be important to the Jews to be able to hook up that family line, particularly through David and Abraham. And that's the genealogy in the book of Matthew. He goes back to David and Abraham. And Jesus is in that family line. And so hooking that up for the Jewish readers is really important. There are phrases in Matthew, a number of them, about the king and the kingdom of heaven. The Jews are looking for that. They're longing for that. It would make sense to them. You're going to run into some Hebrew and Aramaic words that are just sort of put out there without explanation. Look at, in contrast to that, Mark 5:41. Mark 5:41. Mark is not writing to a Jewish audience. So when he runs across Aramaic words, he has to explain them to his readers because they wouldn't know what it was. When Jesus spoke in his earthly ministry, you would find him speaking in Aramaic. Hebrew kind of dialect, but slightly different. You'll find Jesus speaking in Aramaic. So in Mark chapter 5, And what did I say? Verse 41. Taking the child by the hand, he said to her, what? Talitha cum. What is that? That's Aramaic. But look what Mark does with it, which translated means, little girl, I say to you, get up. His audience, not Jews, wouldn't have understood the Aramaic. Talitha cum. They don't know what that is, so Mark has to explain it. But Matthew will run across Aramaic, and he won't have to explain it to his readers. Or customs, he won't have to explain it. Look at Matthew 15 and verse 2. Well, let's back up to verse 1. Then some Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem. Pharisees and scribes, Jewish people. And they said to Jesus, why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread. Period. A Jewish audience understood exactly what that was about. Now, look over at Mark chapter 7, verses 3 and 4. Mark chapter 7, verses 3 and 4. Well, back up to verse 1. Pharisees, some of the scribes, same ones, same setting, Pharisees and scribes gathered around him when they had come from Jerusalem, and they saw, verse 2, they'd seen that some of his disciples were eating their bread with impure hands, that is, unwashed. Then Mark, in his account, puts a parenthetical explanation in there. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they carefully wash their hands, thus observing the traditions of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they cleanse themselves. And there are many other such things, many other things which they have received in order to observe, such as the washing of cups and pitchers and copper pots. Mark's audience didn't understand any of that. So Mark had to put a parenthesis around an explanation of what's going on there. What's this business of washing hands and pots and cups and all? What's all that about? Mark has to explain it to his readers, but Matthew doesn't have to explain it to his because they're Jewish and they already understand about all of that. Then some geographical explanations. Look at Matthew chapter 24, verse 3. Matthew 24, verse 3. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives. Where's the Mount of Olives? Little ways away from the temple. You know that because you've traveled that quite often and you're familiar with the area? You read about it. Okay. So Matthew 24, verse 3, he was sitting on the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us when will these things happen, so on and so forth. Now, look at Mark's account, Mark 13, verse 3. Mark 13, verse 3. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. You see Mark explain that geography? Matthew didn't have to. His readers were Jewish. They know exactly where the Mount of Olives is. Mark's readers, they don't know. Where is it? Well, it's opposite the temple. Just a tiny little ways away, opposite the temple. He's at the Mount of Olives. Where? Opposite the temple. So Mark and Matthew have a very different approach. Matthew doesn't have to explain the Aramaic. They get it. He doesn't have to explain the geography of Canaan land. They get it. He quotes from the Old Testaments in a prolific way because it makes sense to the Jewish mind. He includes a genealogy that links Jesus up with David all the way back to Abraham. That's important to the Jews because the Messiah had to come through that lineage. And unless you can connect that, he can't be the one. So that was important to do. All of these are clues for us. What else do you know about Matthew? What kind of man was he? Who was he? A tax collector. Tell me about a tax collector in the Jews. You don't like tax collectors today, do you? How did they feel about it and why? Who was Matthew collecting taxes for? Rome, the enemy. So he's a traitor to the Jewish people. He's over there siding with Rome, collecting taxes for Rome, and the Jews have a bitterness toward the tax collectors. These are turncoats, these are traitors among the Jewish people because they are siding with the enemy and collecting taxes for them. So this is something that is just abhorrent to the Jews, tax collectors. Jesus picks Matthew to be one of the 12. Not only that, but Matthew is going to write an account of the life of Christ to convince the Jews that Jesus is the Messiah. How powerful must the evidence be for them to accept it from a tax collector? Jesus is the focus, not Matthew. The evidence is so powerful to the Jewish mind that even a tax collector can write this account and convince Jews that he is the one you've been waiting for, the Messiah. That is a powerful statement for Matthew to be writing this account to the Jews. And then, of course, we're going to find very prominent in the book of Matthew miracles and parables. And we'll talk more about those when we get to it. If you look on page 2 of your handout, we're going to begin talking about this genealogy. And there are some things. By the way, I'm not planning on reading all 17 of those verses. It's a genealogy. I want to pull out some particulars about that, unless one of you would like to read all of those names. Did I have who? One of my sons. That was good for them, wasn't it? And they did a good job. I don't know if I forewarned them of that or not. I don't even remember it. I'm forgetting so much stuff. Someone came to me Sunday and said, you did such and so a while back. I didn't remember anything about it. I'm losing it. So anyhow, I'm not planning on reading all of those verses with a list of names, but I do want to pull out some particular notices in those 17 verses that are important to us. The genealogy serves to connect generations as proof of authenticity. There's a reason for that. There's a reason for the genealogies. There's a reason for it in the Old Testament. One of the reasons in the Old Testament is that when they came into the land of Canaan, that genealogy was all about their land inheritance. So if you're in Canaan land and you're of a Jewish tribe, how many tribes? 12. And each of those has clans and families and then individuals in there. And everybody, if you get back to where they're coming into Canaan land, book of Joshua, they're handing out the inheritance. They're going through tribes and families and clans and listing people. And they get this portion and they get that portion. There's detail in that and it's connected to genealogy. Then there's a thing called levirate marriage. What was that about? Old Testament. Not the book of Levi, not the tribe of Levi, not Leviticus. It wasn't about the tribe of Levi. It was something else. Levirate marriage. Anybody know? What was that for? And what was his brother supposed to do? Marry her. This is where you hope your brother had good taste. So he's supposed to marry her and raise up children in his brother's name so that they can keep their inheritance and the family name. You want to maintain the family name and you want to maintain that land inheritance. When you get to the book of Ruth, that's involved in the book of Ruth. When you get into Ruth chapter 4 and Boaz is going to marry Ruth, he's a near kinsman, but he's not the nearest kinsman. He's going to marry her, He's going to redeem her, and He's going to redeem that land that they need to sell in order to maintain a livelihood and keep it in the family. So Boaz goes to the closest relative and said, do you want to redeem this? Do you want to buy this land? And he doesn't want to marry Ruth and raise up children on behalf of Elimelech, because it's going to interfere with his own inheritance. So he says, no, I don't want to do it. So Boaz says, then I will. And he marries Ruth, and they're going to have children. They're going to maintain the family name and the land inheritance. That's all going on through the Old Testament. You need genealogy to be able to do that. And then there's something else with the genealogy, and it does have to do with the tribe of Levi. Could you be a priest if you couldn't prove your genealogy to the tribe of Levi? No way. When they came back from Babylonian captivity, here is Ezra chapter 2, verses 61 and 62. Of the sons of the priests, the sons of Habai, the sons of Hakaz, the sons of Barzillai, who took a wife from the daughters of Barzillai the Gileadite, and he was called by their name. These searched among their ancestral registration, the genealogies, but they could not be located. Therefore they were considered unclean and excluded from the priesthood. Genealogy was important for the Levitical priesthood, for maintaining a family name, for the land inheritance. All of this was critical to the Jewish mind. In the case of Jesus, it's going to prove His connection to all of those Old Testament prophecies and their fulfillment. Go with me to 2 Samuel chapter 7. 2 Samuel chapter 7, beginning in verse 12. When your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendant after you, who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. And he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men. But my loving kindness shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul when I removed it from before, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words and all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. Part of that has a more immediate fulfillment in Solomon. But there are some parts of that enduring forever, a kingdom that's going to endure forever. It wasn't Solomon. That was Jesus. That is a prophecy ultimately about the Christ. To Abraham, Genesis 22, verse 18, in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. That's the inclusion of Jew and Gentile. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Galatians 3:16 pulls that prophecy to Abraham and points out it is fulfilled, and that word seed referred to Christ in particular. You need genealogy going all the way back from Jesus to Abraham to connect him to that prophecy. You need genealogy going from Jesus back to David to connect him to what Nathan said to David. You can't do it without it. Jacob had prophesied that Judah would be the kingly, the royal tribe. We're in Genesis chapter 49, beginning in verse 8. Judah By the way, Jesus is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. That's His lineage. That's His tribe. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down to you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you've gone up. He couches, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion, who dares rouse him up? The scepter, like a king, ruling authority. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Did you turn with me to Genesis 49? I want you to look at Genesis 49, verse 10. Anybody have a footnote by the word Shiloh? What does it mean? Anything? You'll find a couple different definitions there. I'm hearing. Okay, so they're hinting toward Messiah in that, at least including it. Anything else about Shiloh? More literally, until He comes to whom it belongs. Until Shiloh comes. The scepter will not depart from Him until Shiloh comes. The one to whom it belongs. So there is a connection to the tribe of Judah. There's a connection to the prophecy of Nathan to David. There's a connection to the prophetic utterance to Abraham about his seed and all the nations being blessed, plus things that are said to Jeremiah, plus things that are said to Isaiah. Isaiah 53, the suffering servant. And you can just go on and on. In most books of the Old Testament, you'll find something. You'll find Christ in there somewhere. You cannot connect Him to all that without genealogy. And that's what Matthew is doing. When you look at Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 17, who is at the beginning and the ending of that genealogy? Matthew 1, 1 through 17. Who have we got in the beginning? Verse 1, the record of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Verse 17, so all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. Who ends it? The Messiah. Who begins it? The Messiah. Who's in the beginning? Jesus. Who's at the end? Jesus. It's all about Him. You have some three main connectors there in verse 1. Jesus, David, Abraham. And then in verse 17, you have a sort of outline of the genealogy from Abraham to David, from David to Babylonian captivity, from Babylonian captivity to Jesus. That's the genealogy in the book of Matthew. It makes sense to the Jewish mind. As you move through the genealogy, that thing is going to accordion. If you would care to look at that genealogy and do all the exploring you can as you come to each name, all of a sudden, like an accordion, it expands out. It would take you forever to go through that in detail. The Jews, when you mentioned Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all of that clicked in their mind automatically. All of those Old Testament passages unfolded in their Scripture memory. But if you wanted to begin to look at that and study through that, look at verse 2. Abraham was the father of Isaac, was the father of Jacob, was the father of Judah. Let that expand. Do you know what you have to study? The whole book of Genesis. When you come to verse 2, you want to expand that? Study the book of Genesis. As you go through the genealogy, you would have to include the book of Ruth, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. You just have to start expanding that. It would take you forever just to do that in this genealogy. Bill Burton, for those of you who remember him, he's passed on now, but if you remember Bill Burton, he kind of joked one time, he laughed because he went through the book of Jude, and I think he took 26 weeks to do it, because there's so many Old Testament characters mentioned in the book of Jude. It's only one chapter long. It took him 26 weeks to get through it because he let it expand when he came to each name, went back to the Old Testament to look at the history so that we in our day, studying through the book of Jude, can make sense of all of that. Jews, when you mention an Old Testament character or event, their memory was already there. It made sense to them. Randall, you recently went through the book of Jude not too long ago. Did you let it expand? Did you do the book of Jude in 1 week? It's only one chapter, one short little chapter. Did you do it in 1 week? 16 weeks at least? So there goes the accordion, expanding that. That's what we'd have to do in the book of Matthew. I did that to Randall because he makes so much fun of me taking so long to get through stuff. I just wanted to prove a point. So this all made sense to the Jews in mentioning all of these names. They knew the connection that Matthew was pointing out. There are some problems as you go through the genealogy because a genealogy is not always complete. It is sufficient to prove the connections, but it might skip some names. If there's somebody a little less relevant, not much about them, they weren't that important of a character, they just connected one generation to another, it might skip a generation or two. A genealogy is not necessarily exhaustive, hitting every single person in the line, but sufficient to make the connections. And you're going to hit skips like that in Matthew's account, in his genealogy. You will hit some skipping points where it will pass over a generation or two. But it makes the connections that are necessary. When you look at Matthew chapter 1, verse 8, for example, Asa was the father of Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, Joram the father of Uzziah. But there are other kings between Joram and Uzziah. He doesn't mention them. They didn't play that significant of a role. But it's enough to make the connection. So Joram was not strictly the father of Uzzah, but he is in that lineage as an ancestor before him. So be prepared for that. A genealogy is not always exhaustive, but it does the job it's supposed to do. And sometimes a genealogy is looking for an orderly format. So when you get to verse 17, all the generations from Abraham to David are 14. From David to the deportation to Babylon, 14. From Babylon to the Messiah, 14. Well, that's kind of neat. But it does some passing over of some people to get to that nice format. So sometimes there is an orderly form that it's looking for, and it mentions it in ways like that. There's a difference between the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew 1 and that of Luke chapter 3. And I included in your handout a page that I found in Truth for Today commentary. Did a very nice job on that. You can go online, find that out there online. It's made for copying and using in a Bible class. And I copied that for you and put it showing you Matthew's account on the left, Luke's account on the right, and you see it sort of looks like an hourglass. It begins tracking from different sons of David, one Solomon, one Nathan. You're obviously tracking two different people. Then it comes together at a certain point and goes away again and is going to come together again at Joseph and Mary. So that's the easiest explanation of that one is tracking Joseph and one is tracking Mary. And so that is a handy thing to have, that visual of how it does that. Matthew begins with the past and moves forward to Jesus. Luke begins with Jesus and moves backward in time. But Luke does something that Matthew doesn't. Matthew goes back to Abraham. Where's Luke go? He goes to Adam and to God Himself. Luke's writing to a different audience. Matthew, writing to the Jews, they're concerned about David and Abraham. That's their family. Their family began with Abraham. Abraham has Isaac. Isaac has Jacob. Jacob's name is changed to Israel. He has the 12 sons who are the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. That's Abraham's family. Matthew's genealogy goes back through the Jewish family to their forefather Abraham. But Luke's readers, O Theophilus, Greek, Gentile, goes back to our common ancestor in Adam, Garden of Eden, the human race as a whole, not just the Jews. So they have a different purpose. They go back to a different point. One starts from the past, goes to the present. One starts the opposite direction. But you have them both laid out where you can look at them. Matthew traces through David's son Solomon. Luke traces through his son Nathan. And we've already explained how that is. There is another difference here or there that's kind of interesting. But I'm going to pass over that and go to some names that tend to stand out in Matthew's genealogy. It is highly unusual in a Jewish genealogy to find the names of women. They would usually just track the men. But in Matthew's account, you're going to find 5 women. Who are they? Tamar. Next in line. Rahab. Next in line. Ruth. Next in line. Bathsheba. And finally, all the way down to verse 16, Mary. So it's really unusual to find women in a genealogy for the Jews, but there it is. And then you have the situations they're involved in. Who's Tamar? What did she do? What's she so famous for? Anything good? She seduced her father-in-law. Remember? Tamar and Judah. Then you have Rahab. Who's Rahab? Rahab the harlot from the city of Jericho. So there's Rahab. She is non-Israelite. Then you have Ruth. Who's Ruth? What land did she come from? Moab. Non-Jew. Moab marries Boaz. And then you have Bathsheba. Her name isn't actually in the genealogy. If you haven't noticed that, you should. Her name is not actually in Matthew's account. It's more literally David, we're in verse 6. David was the father of Solomon by the one of Uriah. Her name isn't actually there. But she's there. She is the one of Uriah. Interesting how that's noted. And then Mary, the mother of Jesus, who was supposed by many to be in disgrace, being of child without being married. Interesting, you have these 5 women, one who seduces her father-in-law, Rahab the harlot, Ruth the Moabite woman, non-Israelite, Bathsheba, who was in an adulterous relationship with King David, And then Mary, who many suppose to be in disgrace. Foreigners, scandalous beginnings, all of that in the lineage of Christ, possibly suggesting the cleansing and the hope that He brings. Not just for the Jews, but also for the non-Jews, the Gentiles. Even the heroes in the genealogy have stains. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, David, Solomon, Hezekiah, and others. There are good kings, there are bad kings, and through all of that, the ultimate will of God providentially is carried out. Do what you will. Make the decisions you want to make in your life, but you will not interrupt the ultimate will of God in His providential exercise. There is one more significant mention in Matthew's genealogy. We're not going to have time to walk through it tonight, so we will finish up this lesson sheet next time and hand out a brand new one. But the one extra name of extreme importance is Jeconiah. And he is found in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 12. After the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah became the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel. We have some things to discuss about Jeconiah that are of utmost importance. One of the things we'll discover is there is a discrepancy by a scribe in the Old Testament who states that he's 8 years old when he takes the throne. That must of necessity be incorrect. That is a scribal flaw. We'll show it and we'll prove it next week. Number two, there's something about Jeconiah that forbids that Jesus would ever take the literal throne of David in the literal city of Jerusalem. There is no earthly throne of Jesus. The theory of the rapture and that Jesus will have a 1,000-year reign on earth is 100% false. And we will prove it next week in what we discover about Jeconiah. Hope you'll be back for that, and we'll finish this handout sheet and get the next one out to you in our next class. Thank you for your good attention. We are dismissed.